So we're going to get to that. So my name is Colton Jackson, and this project is Electric Waste Orchestra, and I'll be upfront about the fact that Orchestra is a optimistic moniker at this point. This is a club I started at Makerspace Urbana back in Illinois just a few months ago. There's a few demos I have to show off so far, and if demos are 50-50, I mean, well, one of these will work. This one is going okay. The rest of them we might hear, we might not. So I want to tell you a little bit about Makerspace Urbana because without what we had going on there, none of this stuff I'm going to show you would have happened. So it's a humble makerspace, and I want to talk about makerspaces. Oh, this is exciting. Okay, I like seeing the audience. Actually, can I? Or is it better if? Okay, that's great. So it's Makerspace Urbana. If you haven't visited your local makerspace, I encourage you to. If your town doesn't have a makerspace, you could start one. Why not? In our makerspace, it's mostly just kind of big open tables, lots of power outlets. We did get a 3D printer recently, which I 3D printed my glasses on, and I would love to talk to you about that too. It's totally open source tool chain, and so the 3D printer brings a lot of people in, but you'd be surprised how many people you can get to come into your hackerspace just by having like the screwdrivers you need to repair your laptop, because most people don't have those screwdrivers. So we do a lot of repairing. We have a community help desk that people come in, we fix their computers, tell them what a virus is, and they leave a lot of extra computer parts behind because we upgrade the RAM, we upgrade their hard drives, and we say, yeah, we'll stock that in the back. And I kind of grew up in the IT world, and I think anyone else that did realizes how quickly e-waste stacks up because it's not free to get rid of generally. Sometimes you can find someone who will let you toss it away, but it does cost money to disassemble this stuff and to get rid of it or incinerate it. So anywhere you go, any hackerspace, any IT department, they're going to have stacks of hard drives. The hard drives I'm using are like 4 gigabytes. They're not useful to anyone anymore, right? You can get like a thumb drive that's faster and more portable. So this is I'm basically saw all this stuff that we had and saw how wasteful it was being and that it wasn't serving any purpose, and I wanted to find something to do with it. So that was kind of my inspiration for what I started doing. So makerspaces, this has happened because I ripped open an old hard drive, and like while I was tearing it apart, basically I saw a post on Hackaday that you can spin a motor and it creates a sine wave. So I thought, well, I've done some music and I've done enough electronics to know that I can amplify and control things with sine waves. So I thought I'd try it. So as I was like taking apart this hard drive and soldering wires to the back of it, I had some friends who were like, oh, what are you doing? Because that's what makerspaces are about. You're like looking over each other's shoulders, seeing what projects each other are working on. And when you get a bunch of people just like hanging out, working on their own projects, you get this access to expertise that I think money can't buy. It's like you're sitting across the table from like an electronics engineer, and you're saying, oh, I don't know how a motor works. And he says, oh, I'll tell you. I'll get the whiteboard out and explain how a motor works. And so I was like soldering to the motor, and some guys were like, oh, what are you doing over there? I was like, well, I saw that you can get a sine wave off of this, but so I'm not sure exactly how I need to hook it up. And the guys were like, oh, well, hey, let's learn how to use the oscilloscope. I was like, yeah, let's learn how to use the oscilloscope. So I got like a free one-on-one lesson to use an oscilloscope and learned, kind of about just like ground and positive and, really basic electronic stuff that I didn't know yet, but I knew that it was easy enough. I mean, especially when you're surrounded by guys that know their thing. So we tried it. We basically had a lot of fun. Just tearing into an old hard drive can be a lot of fun because usually computers are these black boxes that a lot of people are afraid to touch or afraid to take apart because if they break it, they have to call their nephew and be like, oh, so these are like black boxes that are mysteries to a lot of people. Maybe not people here, but it's fun for people to like take things apart when they don't usually get to, and especially if there's like no penalty for breaking it. That's I make it very clear. That's what we're doing here. We're breaking these things so we can do something else with them. So we tear everything out. We rip the reading head out, and it's just a nice silver disc with a couple of contacts on the back that you can solder directly to. We got that going, and we hooked it up to the sine wave, and I wish we had video, but never figured out how to get micro HDMI going. So So you can look up videos. I got some videos on YouTube, Electric Waste Orchestra. But yeah, we hook this up to an oscilloscope, and you spin it, and it's got produces a sine wave. The faster you spin it, the higher frequency the sine wave. And I'll go ahead and start a demo with just this guy. I got a chip that works pretty well. And oh wait, did I leave my bag down there? Do I got a suitcase sitting over by? Oh, forget it. I can do it. So basically, I did it in software first. Figured out how to control sound with this as an input device. And then figured out an analog amplifier later. And let's see what I can show you to start off. So I'm using this software. I don't know, raise your hand if you've ever heard of Max MSP. Yeah, quite a few. So any of the electronic musicians guys have probably seen what Max MSP can do. So I'm using Pure Data, which a lot of you guys might have also heard about. But it's an open source branch. I don't know if that's the right term, but the guy that did all the math in the back end for Max MSP went off and started his own project. It's all open source, and it works pretty well. And it interfaces with Arduinos. So when I unplug it, it starts making noise. So how many of you are familiar with Arduinos? Probably a lot of you guys. So super popular with hobbyists. So I'm here. I'm not selling a shield. I didn't make a new shield for the Arduino. I just figure Arduinos is something that a lot of people already have. So I thought this is kind of an opportunity to take stuff that people have lying around. If you got a hackerspace, you probably got a stack of Arduinos around too. Then we got free software. So I wanted to make this a really cheap tool chain so anyone that has these parts can start playing around with it. So with the hard drive motor, it's as simple as hooking up one to the analog input. So the Arduinos have the analog inputs, which if you've ever used a voltmeter or an oscilloscope, it's essentially it's an analog to digital converter, and any amount of electricity between 0 and 5 volts gets converted to a digital number. You know, it's 10-bit precision, so it's anyways, anywhere between 0 and 5 volts gets converted to a number between 0 and 1. And you can pass that on to the synthesis software. The Pure Data software has a Arduino library. You can pass that information on. So you can hook up one of the wires to analog in, and it has 6 of those channels. So I'll get to the guitar. It's 6 channels leads to 6 hard drives, which leads kind of to a guitar way to play it. So one's a ground and one's an analog 0 gives you the ability. Get this thing out of the way. Let's see if I have my code ready to go. Multiplier. Reset. So live demos suck, right? Unplug it, plug it back in. Let me just, this thing was working, let me just get back to that.
It's the same thing, right?
Yeah, I was just trying to start, this is the first thing that I figured out, is just, okay, one hard drive, analog input, I can make it spin. And so with Pure Data, it's, you get that number as just an input. It comes in serially, and you can send it to whatever function you want. So there's an oscillation function that takes frequency as an argument. So you can, and this comes in as a number between 0 and 1, like I said. So you can just multiply that input until it's in a range of frequencies that you want, and start spinning it up and getting really crazy noises. But I wrote some code. It's all up on GitHub. Like I said, this is trying to get other people into it, and so it's all open source using open source software. And so the code I wrote basically acts as kind of a capacitor resistor circuit, so it smooths the signal out. It comes in as a sine wave, but since this particular ADC only reads positive voltage, it gets just the top end of the sine wave, so it's like chop, 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 chop. And it's also sampling it a certain number of times per second, so it's grabbing different parts of the sine wave. So really, it's just kind of voltage spikes that I read off the hard drive, and it's like a couple hundred millivolts, a small amount of electricity. But I can bring that into my code and basically have code that the faster you spin it, the longer you spin it, the louder the volume goes up. But as soon as you stop the disk, the volume drops back to 0. So if I can at least connect on that again. File not found. It's not a file. Ah. Yes. Things are happening. So I should have just kept it around. So I'm surprised you didn't say like Mr. Blue Sky, because it is a play off Electric Light Orchestra, and I wish I could play covers for you. So yeah, like I said, so it's 6 channels, and then the rest of them, it just goes to a common ground. So that's what noise sounds like. So yeah, the voltage readers kind of just float around the halfway mark, so it makes noise when nothing's plugged into it. Wow, that's exciting. Let's see what else I was going to say about this while it's playing everything. Right, so the flyer I put up around this to advertise for my club is just Makerspace Urbana. I wanted to have a club where I could get electric engineers and electronic musicians in the same room together. I thought they had a lot to teach each other, but they don't often run into each other. And like Urbana, it's a college town, and you've got the University of Illinois, and the music department and the engineering department on opposite sides of campus, they just don't often run into each other. All right, yeah. So electronic musicians and electronic engineers don't usually run into each other, but I think they had a lot to teach each other, and I had been learning from them just hanging out at Makerspace, so I wanted to get them in the same room. So I whipped up a flyer, put a picture of the oscilloscope on it, and said, electronic engineers, electronic musicians, come in and we'll learn from each other. We'll futz with this stuff. We'll learn some code. We'll learn some electronics. And yeah, at first I thought I was just going to get I just invited engineers and musicians, but I got some guidance from a friend that I'm not a musician or an engineer, so I should invite people that are like me, just people that are interested in learning about electronics and music. So that's when it kind of got this identity of being not just a clubhouse for engineers and musicians, but also an educational opportunity where people could come in and learn how to solder, just simple soldering wires to the back of the hard drive. They could learn a little bit about kind of what these components are inside the computer. So like I said, not just hard drives, but also like the circuit boards they could just tear into and be like, oh, what's this, and just kind of have fun learning about what's inside these things. Or you can dig into old telephones and see all the circuits inside those. And so it's fun just to tear into the stuff. But if you're hanging out with experts that really know what's going on here, and then you've got people that don't know anything yet, like me, then it's a really fun exchange. You get these experts excitedly talking about the things that they know, and people that are really interested in the fact that they showed up in this space where people were willing to teach them. Oh, geez. So this is also a learning experience for me. Usually I'm presenting this to 4 to 5 people at a time. So walking into this room, I think the number of people who knew about Electric Waste Orchestra tripled in here. So this is great. So the firmware on the Arduinos, it's actually just one of the examples. It's called Fermata, and one of the examples is just Fermata analog simple. It just passes along all the analog electronic information, and it doesn't look like it's loaded on the Arduino now. That's weird. If I can find where I set my suitcase, there's something in the front pocket I want to show off. Is it by your photo stuff? Examples. So we can make this a little bit more casual instead of me just like trying to make my demo work. All right, if any of you guys are like hardware guys, we can like kind of do a Q&A, but we'll get back to the demos and stuff. But I want to hear if you guys have ideas of how you could use circuit boards and hard drives, what other hardware have I not thought of? If you've got an idea of materials you have on hand that you can imagine a way to make an instrument. Thank you very much. I can't believe I left that back out there. All right. But okay, so I can show off this analog circuit anyway and get this going. I'll be going through. All right. So this is an op amp. It's a LM like 324. This is a circuit a friend of mine designed, and I'm telling him he's too generous. So I'm going to plug this in. It's noisy. That's be okay. So this just hooks up to the hard drive. So this is something I came up with after playing with the software. A friend of mine's like, well, you can just hook up an op amp to it and amplify the signal and see how it sounds. And this is actually a pretty good instrument now. It's producing a sine wave. I love this place. I was hanging out in the hotel lobby and showing this op to a guy, and he's like, "Oh, it sounds more like a square wave. I think your op amp is clicking the signal." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, thanks, stranger." So this place is awesome. But yeah, so it is producing kind of more of a square wave sound, but it is just the signal just amplified. There's no programming going on here, and it's actually once you can kind of get a little bit of a feel for it. Alligator. Oh, jeez. You can kind of get a feel for like how quickly you spin it and start playing kind of like. So this is something like I just started playing the other day, and it's like it's a totally new form of instrument. You have to kind of get a new feel. So just like your muscle memory on any other instrument, this is like the muscle of how fast you flick it is like how it gets to a certain pitch. So that's like it's a new style. I mean, it's something to work on, and you can actually start playing music with it potentially if you're dedicated to it. But with the code, it's really interesting to find out like you can program what sounds it makes. This is just like whatever signal comes out of it is what you got. But if you go the software route, you can say, okay, well at this voltage, if I'm producing 100 millivolts, if I'm producing, there we go. If I'm producing 100 millivolts, then play a C. If I'm producing like 120 millivolts, play a D. You can do that software stuff in software defined. And if I can, I'll try to get that coming back up here. Standard. And yeah, I did want to talk a little bit about like why using e-waste is kind of an interesting material. Not just because it's a free material and we all have it stacked up, but it's like if you wanted to design a physical instrument to play digital music, and I like the idea of that because, you know, of course, all these sounds, you could just like write code to produce these sounds. But I think it's really valuable to have a physical interface. I'm going to move that from my crotch. If so, I think it's really valuable to have a physical interface to the digital music because it's just something more tactile, something that you can actually like, get up on stage with and not just sit on a laptop. So I had the idea that I did want to design physical instruments. But if you had like sat down in a Radio Shack or in a hackerspace and you have all these knobs and sliders and touchpads and you can like design any instrument in the world, it's kind of like a really daunting blank canvas, right? Like it's like I kind of think it's hard to imagine something that you haven't seen before. You're just bound to come up with something that's been designed before. Just like you're trying to think of what you could draw on a blank canvas. But when you kind of go rummaging through your garbage pile and you see a ScanMan controller board, it's got all these kind of nice big solder points on the back that you can touch. It creates it gives you something to work with. It also gives you boundaries to work within. You have to start thinking, okay, I have to make something out of this material. Now what can I make? And you end up with an instrument that you wouldn't have otherwise designed from scratch because you had to work within boundaries that have been given to you, or at least what you picked out because it was sitting in front of you. And some of this stuff, I also wanted to start making stuff with this because I thought it was really attractive. I mean, maybe some of you guys can empathize. It's like there's a good aesthetic to circuit boards. You know, this sort of like really kind of chaotic, but it's very organized. So I wanted to get this stuff out of the garbage bin. I mean, it's not it's separate from the garbage bin. It's just like sitting up and gathering dust. And I wanted to do something with it. So I went over all this. So with musical instruments, it's kind of a fun thing that you can get people together on, and people that wouldn't otherwise have come in for a soldering lesson or to learn programming. It's like, oh, I'll try to build a musical instrument. I'll see what it looks like. Sorry? I think hard drive was the first thing because basically I had been futzing around with Arduino. I knew that it had the analog converter, and I had seen this software that could use the analog. So the hard drive was the first thing that I saw, okay, I can make a signal with this, and I can control something with that signal. These ISA boards are really fun because, so I looked up like a schematic and figured out, okay, it takes 5 volt. I can provide 5 volt with an Arduino. And as the power goes through all this, when you touch the kind of cross circuits, short circuits with your fingers, your fingers conduct enough electricity to screw stuff up. So you can short circuits and change the voltage that's coming out of all these data pins. So it communicates with the computer, through these data pins by shifting the voltage up and down really rapidly. But actually, especially with this really old stuff, one of these pins just it's just like a floating point number. It's just sitting at this number, and I can make it go up and down if I had my hardware running. Done uploading. Oh. Okay, I'm going to unplug it. You're out? Oops. Almost there. So I'm coming to you guys basically with this kind of, this is the stuff that we came up with in our club for a few months. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you guys afterwards and figuring out what kind of new stuff we can make. And I'm glad that I get this chance to show it off. Okay, so I'll go over like how this is coded to give you an idea of like what's possible with this software. Um, so essentially, it's 6 oscillators that each have a frequency set to them. And the volume of that oscillation is set to 0 until you spin the hard drive associated with that oscillator. So I think in this version, oh, that's noise. Okay, so it's okay. Noise is coming in somewhere. Okay, so it should be quiet right now, but it's wired funny. There's extra noise happening. So it's okay. So I'll shut it up for a second. It's turning the volume up on each of those notes as I spin it. And I have the numpad. It's just a USB numpad. There's nothing hacked about it. But there's a function in Pure Data where you can make things change as a response to keystrokes. So when I hit the number 1, it sets notes to all, and it can use MIDI numbers. So you can set in MIDI values like 70, 74, 76, and set what note each hard drive is going to control. And then as I go up the numbers on the numpad, it can kind of go up the scales in whatever scale you want it to. I think I tried to do a C major scale. I think one of them, the notes is wrong, but yeah. So you can program it any way you want, and when you're, I don't know, it's really neat to sit down with people who don't know music and show them that this is a way that they can start playing music. You don't need to get like muscle memory around your piano. You can just like program the code to respond to whatever interface you have going. So it's, yeah, I think you guys get the idea, but. So to not do myself to further failed demos, I'll say that's kind of to wrap it up, but we got this room for like another 20 minutes. So if you guys want to come up, this stuff works better in a non-stage setting. So come up and see some of this equipment I got, and we'll kill the rest of the time. So thank you. You're welcome to try out the guitar. So come on up and get your picture taken.
Hello. Here I am. Okay, good evening, Hope. From this strange position, it is my pleasure to introduce the next presentation. But before I do that, just a couple of announcements. First of all, you all look really weird from this angle. Second of all, just a reminder that the concert is going on tonight at 10 p.m. by the escalator that leads up to the mezzanine on the first floor. If you were there last night, you know how insane and wonderful it was. If you weren't there last night, this is your chance to make up for that dreadful, dreadful state of affairs. So tonight at 10 p.m., check that out. A couple other things going on. As you know, the talks are all pushed forward an hour, but I'll mention it anyway. All the talks are pushed forward an hour. And due to stuff running over earlier today. Also, as a result, also the how to install Linux on your time machine talk has been postponed to 3 p.m. yesterday, but it's going to have been wonderful. If you got your TV begun when you registered and there was a stack of batteries for you to take a battery, yeah, the trip glasses rather, not TV begons, thank you. If you got your trip glasses and you saw the little packages of batteries, the batteries seem to have taken a walk somewhere. So if you find them, please turn them in at any desk, and we will very much appreciate getting those back.
Oh, Stalin did it.
Am I over here?
I needed them for my Gen 2 time machine.
Can we get, are we good? Yes, no, maybe? Back over here again. So, I do. So for it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our next talk. Our next speaker is a good friend and a brilliant fella, and this is his presentation on hacking money. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Finn Brunton.
All right. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Does this work? There's no hope for this? Okay. Yeah, I think I might. I kind of like this because I feel like I should have a cigarette, you know? It's got kind of a put the blame on MAME thing happening. So hi, everybody. Hello, Hope. Oh yeah, that's a very good idea. I need to whistle the Mission Impossible theme song.
I just need a cape, actually.
This is the miracle worker who totally figured out how to fix the bizarre projection problem we were having in seconds.
Turn it on and off again?
Yeah. All right. No, trust me, if I was doing this, I would be missing a thumb by now. There'd be blood all over the stage.
There's a reason we use keyboards, not wrenches.
Yes.
If you're using a wrench on it,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. All right. Good stuff. Thank you, sir. Hi, so my name's Finn Brunton. I'm an assistant professor at NYU. I live at finb.net. That's also where you can email me. I wrote a book about the history of spam, which, you're hardly encouraged to buy, but I just learned that another copy has been uploaded to LibGen if you want to go there instead. And I am super nervous. I'm currently working on a book about obfuscation with Helen Nissenbaum. If you saw Daniel Howe's talk, it touched a little bit on some of those things. And I'm researching a book about digital cash and cryptocurrencies. And I'm a huge money nerd, and this is proof. This is me posing at the site of the Bretton Woods Monetary Conference. We actually had a bunch of pictures inside the hotel, but they kicked us out after a while. If you go on tour to find places where major money policy events happened, I think that kind of qualifies you for nerd cred. And Hope is pretty much the best conference that I attend. And I understand how brutally high the opportunity cost is for choosing one thing over another. So I really appreciate you giving me an hour of your precious Hope time. And so what can you get from this talk for your sort of your hour of attention, especially given that like you all have been primed for like world historical significance, you know, we the Ellsberg Snowden thing, and then we took a deep dive into what I'm about to do. So just brace yourselves. What I want to give you over the course of the next 45 minutes or so are some big ideas and the room to use them for the project of transforming money technologically as a way of transforming society for the better. And my sort of bona fides for that is that I'm actually mostly a historian. I work on the history of science, technology, especially things like digital computation, which is part of why I love being here, because this place is a living tradition. This is a place that goes straight back to the dawn of what we can think of as kind of the 20th century radical use of technologies, which is so it's very exciting to be here and talk about the future. And what I want to suggest is that money is something that you can and should hack on. I want to say, to sort of paraphrase Ted Nelson, you can and must understand money now. And I want to suggest that we do this not just by making contributions to altcoin development or pitching in on building better exchanges, although those are both good things, very useful and valuable. I'm going to talk about what I really mean by changing money, by hacking on money, in a second. Now, I want to also have one quick preface here, which is that I had this kind of initial impulse. I was really nervous because this is Hope. This is like, you know, the best audience basically ever. So I thought I would give this like totally responsible talk that was full of like careful points of historical reference. A friend of mine said, your slides are always really boring. You should like start to jazz them up a little bit. So I decided that for all the things that were said in the 80s, it would kind of look like that. 80s through the mid 90s, it looked like two analog synthesizers like fucking in front of a Nagel print or something. I just love that nice gradient. Anyway, I was going to give this really responsible talk that was going to kind of like build on historical precedent and talk about R&D and cash cards and electronic purses in the 1990s. You're welcome to come up and talk to me about that afterwards if you'd like. It's an amazing area of history. It's incredibly understudied. And, you know, early hash cash style systems and lessons learned and all that sort of thing. But then I realized, like, this is Hope. So instead I'm just going to rant and be completely irresponsible and hope that no one that I work with is watching the live stream. And part of what I would like to do is forecast some future stuff a little bit. And obviously, telling the truth and telling the future are very different things. So I'm going to tell you a story about a place that I think the future can go, about a way that I think we can fork history in a positive direction with the kinds of technologies that we have available. So let's start this off with a very big bet. I bet that the next century plus is going to have a recurring theme, and that recurring theme is going to be infrastructural struggles for autonomy. Infrastructural. These events will have profound consequences, but they will play out at levels well below the visibility of a war or an insurgency or an election. They will be contested and fought in the kind of domains that you think of when you think of, I'm going to move this so I'm not constantly wandering away from the damn microphone. There we go. Okay, very nice, yeah. When I'm up here and nervous, I didn't realize that it kind of sounded like a really bad cell phone call, you know, quieter, louder. So infrastructural struggles for autonomy. Infrastructural. This means these struggles are going to be played out in the places that you think when you think of phrases, words like standards, architectures, gateway, spectrum, interoperation, airspace, routes, borders, protocols, logistics, regulations, chips, licensing, algorithm, identification and authentication, property, things like that. And they will be struggles. These will play out anywhere on the spectrum between disputes and war. The world will always be stricken, thank you, Getty Images, looping, GIF, which I didn't pay for. And yes, I pronounce it GIF, fucking come at me, I don't care. These struggles will play out anywhere in the spectrum between disputes and war, because the world will always be stricken with thugs, bullies, and tyrants, and the quislings, enforcers, and functionaries who do their bidding. But now their loathsome work will be taking place in the amazing technologies that we are starting to live with and helping to build here, just as it always has in the exclusion zones, the slave ships, the star chambers, the supermax prisons, and the cabinets noirs. They always have throughout history, and we need to oppose them with the same level of energy and inventiveness that we have always brought to the table. And finally, autonomy. These struggles will be over many domains, but I believe that likely and encompassing concern will be autonomy, self-governance, horizontality, decentralized and distributed systems, processes, and people, things that can be disarticulated from one of the handful of major global historical dynamics of the last 3.5 centuries, which is the steady, escalating ratchet of consolidation and centralized control. We're right on the front lines at Hope of a number of early forms of these infrastructural struggles, and we've heard many fascinating talks about versions of them over the last 2 days. They're only going to get bigger and crazier and more consequential, these battles, and yet they're going to get more invisible, harder to see, and therefore more urgently requiring our explanation and advocacy as well as technical additions from here on out. And I believe that money will be one of the 5 or 6 primary theaters in which this 21st century struggle is going to happen. So what the hell is money? Money is a puzzle, first and foremost. There are fossils in the beautiful limestone of the Piacenza Mountains in Italy. The shells of creatures from teeming Mesozoic seas, interred in the bare rocks of the highest peaks of the mountain range. How did they come, asked Leonardo da Vinci, to be up so high? There are cowrie shells, huge piles of cowrie shells, in the arid regions of West Africa, thousands of miles from the Indian Ocean where the sea snails lived. We can ask with da Vinci, are we to believe that the flood reached so far? Of course, the cowrie shells, which appear here in a radical from ancient Chinese, which gradually transforms into the current classical Chinese symbol for money. These fossils, these cowrie shells, cowrie shells, are removed by a force even more powerful in some ways than geology, the force of trade, of things being tokened as money. To be more exact, cowrie shells were one of the things that oiled the operation of the terrible machine of the West African slave trade. So if cowrie shells can be money, then where do we draw the line? Where does it end? This is the great Martin Schubeck, and I love this because this seems like a classic kind of like trippy 90s, like high theory, abstract thing, you know? There is no basis, money is whatever, but Schubeck is not some kind of trippy guy. Schubeck is the guy who wrote Theory of Money and Financial Institutions. He's one of the great monetary theorists of the 20th century. He's a game theory dude. He's actually really into computers. And this was the best he could do. And I think this is very accurate. And the rules of the game are really complicated, and who gets to make those rules is enormously important. Because let's get back to cowrie shells. Once you'd actually use them in trade, it's not like you could actually do anything with them aside from make jewelry. But as it turns out, jewelry really matters. Jewelry does social signaling. It signifies prestige. Sharing it or giving it or demanding it cements bonds and relationships and alliances, and it knits groups together. Jewelry is a high bandwidth communication system. And maybe we can think of cowrie shell jewelry as being kind of like a terrific Google query ranking. I mean, modulo all the various problems with Google query rankings. But when you Google something, the first thing that comes up, that's a powerful symbol. That's who comes first. That's what really matters. That's the most important thing for the vast majority of people who only look at the first 3 results. And now, cowrie shells are kind of like that. You see who has the most. When you go into a space, you know who you need to talk to, you know who you need to ask favors of, except these are also, unlike many Google search query rankings, these are negotiable. These are liquid. You can give them to your friends and your cronies. You can move influence and power around. You can do business from the Maldives to Timbuktu to the trade bazaars of Western China. And of course, that means that these are also about moving power around. Notice all of these words like status and prestige, and of course, slaves. The property of moneyness is shaped by the rules of the game, and making the rules of money lets you restructure society itself at a very fundamental level. The rules of money can help to enforce and build on existing social and political structures, or they can undermine them, and we can see these powers with extra clarity when we see whatever passes for conventional money run low or run out. Ta-da! So take the Knights Hospitallers, the Knights of Malta, who'd received the privilege of mintage, the right to strike coin to function as tender. And we'll come back to that privilege and how you get it and what it means. In the 1530s, They were put under siege by the Ottoman Empire. This is a depiction of them on their island. I really like, for cartography geeks out there, I really like how this projection works to sort of gang everything together. They were under siege by the Ottoman Empire. It was an extraordinarily brutal siege, even by early modern standards. People shot the decapitated heads of Turks out of cannons. The Turks put dead people on crucifixes and floated them out to sea. The knights had torched all the crops before they retreated into the fortress. They poisoned all the wells. And then the Turks left. The siege broke. Now, the knights had a problem because they were sitting on a rock with completely annihilated cities and towns and shattered fortresses and almost no access to resources and wells that they had filled with a mix, and this is one of my favorite little details, of dead animals, hemp, fungally diseased wheat, and arsenic to make sure that the Turks couldn't successfully extract water from it. They were in the, I know, yum, yum. Yes, yeah. You know, Club Mate also has, you know, God knows, taurine and nicotine in there somewhere. Yeah, yes. So they were in this disaster zone, and they knew that the Ottomans were actually coming back. They had very, very little in the way of money. They'd run out of bullion, out of the precious metals that they could mint coins from. You'd think being sacred knights with the backing of the Pope, they could just order people around, but even in the early modern period, there was no dice. So they did something kind of incredible. They took their privilege to make money, and they started striking these coins made of copper with the device of a handshake and the insignia that you can see around the rim there, non eas sed fides, not the copper or not the metal, but the trust. These coins are traded on trust. That's sort of what they do. You'll notice also the date is way later. They kept issuing these coins for a long time. This is just the highest resolution image I could find of one. This issue, these coins, came with a promise that the coinage could be redeemed in silver once the knights were back on their feet. So they would buy with the coins and the value of silver to get the stuff they needed to rebuild the cities and the fortresses and get the cannons and all the rest of it. And then eventually you'd be able to redeem it once everything worked out. And it worked. You can rebuild a whole city on trust if you have enough trust. Of course, it helps to be legendary religious war heroes and have your own island, but still, it's a starting point. Or take the Irish banking strike, moving closer to the present day, of 1970. The banks went on strike on the 1st of May, and they didn't reopen until mid-November. So think about this. All the banks close. You can't deposit checks. You can't get money out. No one can do anything financial. This is the era before ATMs, but even so, the ATMs wouldn't have been restocked after a limited period in any case. There was some advance warning, so people had some time to stockpile cash. But within a few weeks, the supply had already begun to run low. Employers were cutting deals with retail stores and churches to get their hands on enough ready, because churches have like tithing and poor boxes, and they have a lot of cash around. So to get enough ready money to pay wages. And as I'm sure you know, things shortly afterwards collapsed into lawlessness with roving gangs of new wave cannibals and post-apocalyptic thunderdomes. Or not, actually. Yeah, that's basically accurate. This is just outside of Dublin. Admittedly, but bearing in mind the money issue, because instead, people started using their checkbooks. They'd write checks for what they needed, and within smaller communities, the checks themselves started to become a kind of negotiable paper backed by the social graph. Individuals, families, and businesses all kept their own ledgers. These are the checks I'm holding from others, so that's kind of roughly what I have to work with, and these are the checks I have out to everyone else. In less tight-knit environments, like neighborhoods and cities, the reservoir of trust became the local pub. If someone was trying to float a substantial check, you'd go in and ask the bartender at their local whether they were an acceptable credit risk. The person who's chronicled most of this economic history phrased it this way. I love it when economists make jokes. Because bartenders could be trusted in a way that might be very difficult for other kinds of backing. As the blank checks started to run out, people began to make their own wonderfully elaborate IOUs with their banking information on it, countersigned by neighbors and friends and relatives. The strike did eventually end, of course, and it took the banks months to reconcile the intricate layers of transactions, because you couldn't just go through all the checks in one person's hands, because then they were leaning on other people's checks. There was this whole house of cards. Person A had issued against person B, who issued against person C, but nonetheless, there was astonishingly little fraud, like shockingly little, much less than you would expect. Of course, this wasn't a blissful utopia of mutual aid and social credit. As you can imagine, if you had any need for imports or foreign exchange, you were pretty well screwed. And of course, all this did lean on the fact that the banks would, in fact, eventually reopen. But to an astonishing degree, this system of moving social credit around worked. Indeed, the economy actually grew a bit. So to oversimplify, within a few months, you were drawing assets that weren't backed by government-issued notes, but by the social resiliency and internal trust of a tight-knit community of which you were a part. A reputation economy, essentially. So we have tons of examples of things like this and related systems that you can buy into because they work for you and you believe in them. Money is a form of allegiance, and this is where we're going to start circling back to cryptocurrencies. So what do you have an allegiance to? Well, maybe it's the local economy of the colonies, and eventually the notes issued by the revolutionary government of the United States. These were printed by Benjamin Franklin. I love his little, if you see over there on the note on your right, the counterfeit is death in the kick-ass metal Gothic font there. But also notice the leaf print. I just want to point this, look at what an amazing badass Franklin could be. He had done these books for a British naturalist who had wandered around in America getting leaf prints, and Benjamin had figured out how to print the leaves against plaster, cast metal against that, and he soon realized, wait a second, these leaves are really easy for me to print. They're really hard for people to reproduce by hand if they're trying to engrave their own plates to counterfeit this money. He had discovered something like the PNP problem of stuff. He had found a way of using something that was easy to verify but very hard to fake. Anyway, Franklin was pretty amazing. But yeah, so maybe you have an allegiance to these new colonies and their weird half-assed system of money with leaves on it. Or maybe you have an allegiance to the Limerick Soviet, where you are actually being issued money in which you are being promised by the workers of Limerick. It only lasted for a few months. Or maybe you have an allegiance to the idea that human time is the only really valuable commodity, in which case you very likely held notes from Uzziah Warren's Time Store in Cincinnati in the 1820s. This was an incredible project, which really did attempt to denominate the value of everything in the time a skilled person would spend on it. So who's skilled, Warren debated for a while, and then he eventually settled on carpenters, which is why the benchmark for value here is hours a skilled carpenter can work and corn. Those are the major sort of modes of exchangeability. Or maybe it's the anarchist economics of Silvio Gesell, who wanted to build local demurrage currencies, which is to say currencies that actually lose value with time deliberately, to put people who hold money on the same footing as people who hold things like food or crops or other things that can kind of rust or rot or go away. But I love this so much because this is the flip side of one of Gesell's Freigeld notes. This is money that has its own man page. This is money that has its own instructions for use and manifesto explaining why you should be using it, which is pretty awesome. And needless to say, because this is so wonderfully geeky, naturally there's a cryptocurrency version now too, Frycoin, with an incredibly elaborate system of related things. If there's a Frycoin person here, please come talk to me. I love you guys. You are so amazing. Or maybe, hell, let's look at something that doesn't even look like money as we recognize it. Maybe it's something like tally sticks, a physical database made out of wood that lets you keep track of who has rights to which cow on a particular alp. This is a Swiss set of tally sticks here, and like it says at the bottom, this really does keep track of 87 cows among 23 different people. The beauty of it is that you can actually make these out of wood, carve them in certain ways, split them so that it's impossible for someone to change theirs without changing the other, because otherwise you identify the difference. And don't necessarily laugh at this as a mechanism. The entire financial architecture of Britain for centuries was built on tally sticks issued by the Exchequer, made from the willows that grew by the Thames. They did big money with this stuff, money you owed to the king, money the king owed to you, the barons gambling land away, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They don't get the prominence they deserve because when they decided to modernize their financial system, they burned them. Because, who wants to have these embarrassing relics around? So they destroyed this beautiful wealth of financial history and also overheated the chimney and burned down Parliament, which didn't turn out. So to have a little Jason Scott interlude here, this is further proof, don't fucking throw things away. Don't needlessly destroy things you don't need to destroy. You can never tell when you're trying to scrub all those old hard drives that you might accidentally like degauss everything. Who knows? So this is all to say, money is a significant part of what Benedict Anderson, the great political theorist, called imagined communities, the way we feel that we belong in a deep sense to groups, countries, nations, peoples, whom we'll never entirely know, who may not even have territory or formal structure. Money is a way that we can sort of vote, that we can ally ourselves with things. But of course, we all do this. We all show which allegiances we have. Everyone in this room has probably done multiple transactions in United States Federal Reserve notes today. And those are based on trust, too. Both that we trust that the notes we're accepting and passing aren't counterfeit, and in a deeper sense, that the Federal Reserve will not print too much money at once, and thereby render what we hold valuable, or not less valuable, or even worthless. And this, of course, requires backing in multiple forms. This is a very brief interlude, but I couldn't resist. Confidence in money is so fascinating, because to mean that money is not easily counterfeited, they have to put an amazing amount of technological thought into the architecture of physical currency, ranging from reading systems, which no longer really serve this purpose because there's not a lot of value in the metal in coins, but back in the old days was designed so you couldn't trim the edges of the coins off with a very sharp knife to get the little fine filings of silver while still letting the coin keep its initial face value. So yeah, they had to widely implement this so they could really see when you were starting to scrape stuff away. Isaac Newton had people drawn and quartered for doing things like this. This used to be a way more barbaric field than it is now. The sheer amount of technology that goes into securing a single note is an absolutely extraordinary thing. And forget about like the thermoreactive inks and the security threads and all the rest of it. Let's talk about one of my personal favorite things, which I bet a number of you are familiar with because this is hope, which is when you look at a US 20, notice the little yellow 20s that are scattered around in a cloud on one corner of the bill, and then notice the O's in that cloud, which fall into an arrangement called the Urian constellation, which is the subject of a collective agreement among quite a lot of different currency issuing countries and central banks and mints, and also the people who work on the firmware for color photocopy machines, that something that has the Urian constellation in it will not let itself be scanned or photocopied. It will not generate a page as a result of that. It is identifiable. You should look into the patents for this because the patents are fascinating. They're very thoughtful. And this is kind of a real world version of the William Gibson sci-fi idea of the ugliest t-shirt in the world, the t-shirt that exempts whoever is wearing it from being able to be digitally captured. But it goes even beyond that in other ways. There's really incredible research going on right now into trying to figure out, because it's not just the Urian constellation. There's fascinating work going into trying to figure out what it is that is in money that makes it so that things like Adobe Photoshop can recognize when you're attempting to scan a note in or make changes to banknotes from particular countries. People are trying to sort of break down precisely how that works. The policing of images of notes, again, to maintain confidence in the currency is an extraordinary project. You have to write to this dude in order to get high-resolution images of banknotes that you can do things with. You have to make a case to this guy and send a letter to his office, which is just delightful to me. But then there's the question, of course, of long-term value, and we're going to circle back to that in a second. Not just the question of whether or not whatever you're holding is counterfeit or not, but the question of how valuable it's going to be in the long term. Let's stay with the question of trust, because talking about trust means talking about the privilege to mint and specify currency. And that's the second most important privilege of the sovereign or the sovereign nation. And that's part of why cryptocurrencies are so important. Because as it turns out, being able to specify currency and mint currency is a great way to get people to do what you want. Let's say you want to conquer the world. You need an army, and that army is going to have a lot of foreign mercenaries in it. And these foreign mercenaries are not going to be cool with some kind of magic social credit scheme where you have to go talk to a bartender and then look at someone's GitHub stats, and then you get a special coupon that lets you have 2 hours of carpentry. They want cash. They want cash that they can spend in their home countries. So now you have two problems. You need to get cash for them, and you need to make that cash good wherever they travel. So if you're Alexander the Great, who faced exactly these problems, you realize, or rather some very smart people who work for you realize, that each problem is actually the solution to the other problem. As the sovereign, you can order the issue of coin in silver as soldiers' wages. And then as your soldiers conquer, you can demand payment of taxes and ransoms and tributes in your currency. So you've created instant demand. Suddenly everyone would really like to get their hands on some so they can pay their taxes and not get killed. And of course, war is also a terrific source of slaves, which is what you need to work the silver mines in Macedonia and Thrace, and booty, like the hordes of bullion from the Persians. So soon you've got this insane proto-military industrial complex going, where the demand for soldiers' pay stokes the fires of a Moloch of enslaved miners and the expansion of the imperial tax base. It turns out to be like drinking seawater. The more you have, the more you need. Now, the thing is, as monstrous as this plan is, it can actually kind of work okay, but let's say it doesn't. Some battles fall through, the sun is in your eyes, you know, who gives a shit? Something goes wrong with your amazing plan, and you kind of need to make a lot more money. Ancient Rome is where we get the term money. Ancient Rome is actually where we get the term money from the Temple of Juno Moneta, which was the point of issue of the denarius. And it was probably one of the most densely populated cities in the world, to this day, in parts, little districts of it. Think of Lagos or Mumbai. And it was a near total consumption and service economy city, with a metropolitan culture obsessed with the trappings of lifestyle, with elite goods and sumptuary excess. And it had a restive population, which was not afraid of the occasional riot. So when things get a little rough, you kind of can pad out the trouble if you're in charge of making the currency by adding some extra copper to the bullion. You need to pay more troops and keep the flows of grain moving into the capital, so then you add some more. And slowly over time, the money becomes less and less valuable in trade. All kinds of problems begin to appear. And this problem, this crisis, is massively increased by the transition to heavily leveraged paper money. That's Gutenberg freaking out from a cartoon in 1921 as huge amounts of money pour out of a printing press. If you're facing a crisis or a brutal trade deficit, or you want to fund yet another fucking war, you can always just open the spigot and print more money. A little inflation can be a very good thing, encouraging investment, and too much of it can be a catastrophe. And even though this happens all the time, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Poland, Brazil, Taiwan, you name it, it still very rarely gets discussed as the constant reality that it actually is. And it's really almost overwhelmingly shocking. I've spent a lot of time reading about the Weimar hyperinflation, which is sort of the touchstone for this in many ways. And it's astonishing the degree to which it turns the world upside down. Being a responsible person, being a person who carefully accumulates savings and puts away money for your future or your children's future, who gets a pension from a lifetime of hard work, is actually an enormous failing on your part. You're immediately penalized, you're wiped out. But as it turns out, being a debt-ridden compulsive gambler, you're good, you know? Like you're actually set in a hyperinflation state. Because the money becoming rapidly more worthless means your debts are suddenly much smaller than they were. You can gamble a lot more. Everyone starts gambling. It makes people crazy. It damages people to go through that experience of suddenly having all of your weaknesses exposed and having to be paid every single day at lunchtime so you can sprint out and buy groceries before the prices go up by mid-afternoon. So, on that extremely grim note, let's start to kind of shift towards people who are beginning to think about what to do about this. This is just a beautiful image of Notgeld, which was money that was issued by everyone other than the state during the hyperinflation period. So you could at least transact in cash that was issued by like your church or your town or your friends, which actually, again, worked pretty well. There are people who take the possibility of hyperinflation as the inevitable tendency of the state that they must prepare for now by stockpiling things like water filters and heirloom seeds and ammunition and silver, and by building, I hope that was for heirloom seeds and not necessarily the ammo part, but we're going to talk about ammo a little bit too. But because I wanted to go in the world where the people were who were really trying to live this concept of alternative currency systems, who are really trying to actually apply it. So I've been doing a lot of travel, and I just wanted to briefly mention seeing a lot of this in practice, most recently in New Hampshire a couple weeks ago, among the utilikilts. And nothing against utilikilts, they're so awesome, but there's just something about like that image of like a guy with a utilikilt and he's like vaping and he's got a giant braided beard and he's wearing like a Debian t-shirt, and I was like, this is kind of like hope, you know, actually. Except that he also has like an assault rifle, but yeah, this was hanging out with radical libertarians and anarcho-capitalists and stuff. And what was really fascinating, and I'm happy to discuss this more, I learned a lot of bacon-related recipes. What was fascinating about this was to see precisely how this adoption was playing out in ways that I think have useful things to tell us about the near future. People very rarely transacted in one thing. They transacted in baskets of different things. You can see the spread of different cryptocurrencies here, as well as US dollars, silver, and hugs. But they still denominated everything in dollars, which is interesting. It's almost like historically, for centuries, Europe denominated almost all transactions in a kind of imaginary money, pounds, shillings, and pence, which people used to sort of set terms by which they could trade, even though they might be using completely different coins and completely different sets of things for their exchange. But yeah, you could see all this in practice. Publishers paid their authors in Bitcoin or Dogecoin or Litecoin or whatever. People paid Afghani bloggers. It was fantastic. And yeah, it was enormously interesting to see the kind of constant exchange projects that were taking place, and I'm not sure if you can read this on this slide, but the attempts to explain to people who are like anarcho-primitivists, you know, who like lived like hobbits in the depths of the woods and, you know, made their own like biltong, to try to explain to them that you have to include a few satoshis as a miner's fee because otherwise your transaction won't go through and be added to the blockchain. And of course, they were also obsessed with precious metals. But you can see that there's a whole dialogue that's starting to take place here. The hemp pretzels were really disgusting. It broke my heart. You wanted to love them because they were making them themselves. It was very innovative, but they were so gross. But you can see how there's actually kind of a whole dialogue happening here, a really fruitful dialogue, a dialogue I think we could be having within the hacker community about what it is that makes money valuable, about the kinds of value that money can provide. And I just have to mention the moment when a blogger and cryptocurrency activist, I kept asking people, like, a lot of the tools that make up Bitcoin have actually been around for a while in different forms. Why did it really click now? And she grabbed my arm and said, because the earth is fertile with unrest, which is a pretty kick-ass sort of, you know, thing to hear. And what unified all these different people, the people who are making bacon pancakes, the people who are only taking silver quarters from pre a certain period, et cetera, and this is where we move towards the future, is that they were starting to develop new and nuanced models of community, collaboration, and trust. Hacking money, this is getting back to the central point, what it's based on, how it's issued, and how it moves around is, again, this is an opportunity to hack the social architecture itself. Because what backs money is one of the fundamental statements of value that a society can make. Is it human time? Is it the God-given right of the sovereign to rule? Is it post-war American military might? Or is it cryptography, mathematics, the shallowness of bugs given enough eyes? Science fiction is a wonderful source of thought experiments for this. Ian Banks, and how could I not include this as a slide with my topic this time around? Ian Banks imagines currencies that are convertible for categories of different things like land, fixed quantities of elements, and computational work, which is an enormously interesting sense of like, yeah, those things are actually really pretty valuable in particular ways. Stable elements, of course. No one's going to give you hafnium for your coins. And people often forget, I find, that Margaret Atwood's masterpiece, or one of her masterpieces, is partially a book about economic warfare. In fact, it's a book about data mining, because what initiates the monstrous, theocratic, patriarchal dystopia in which this novel takes place is the fact that they can relatively easily put together the identities, the genders of holders of money with their accounts, and thereby freeze the assets of one side of society as part of the process of consolidating control. But we actually live in a world that has very limited values when it comes to figuring out what backs money, what makes money valuable. And this is another place where we can just crack things wide open. This is the last old-timey thing, I promise. The guy on the right, you're right there, is John Locke, the enormously important theorist of liberalism and liberty. The guy on the right is William Lowndes, Locke's contemporary Secretary of the Treasury. They had a huge throwdown that was known as the Great Recoinage Debate that set the terms under which we still talk about money today. The coin issued by the Bank of England had become hopelessly compromised. It had a lot of inflation, the coins had been clipped and sweated, which meant that people would like shake them up in bags so they'd rub together and rub off enough silver dust that you could like extract from the seams while they would still notionally be good. And a lot of people simply couldn't get ready money at all because the coins had become less valuable than the silver that they contained. So any smart person was just grabbing them right, left, and center, melting them down and selling the bullion out of the country. Everyone knew they had to recoin. The mint had to take the stuff back in and recoin. The question was, should they recoin the coins to their original value in silver, or should they recoin them to reflect their current value? This sounds very abstract, but just bear with me, because we're still stuck with this fucking debate. Lowndes took the latter position. He said, money is credit. The coins are just the physical representation of credit. The pound was in trouble because it's inflated, so let's recoin it to its actual value, which means less silver in the coin, you know, smaller coins, whatever. And then Locke said, well, hell no. Let's recoin the coins up to their original weight. The promise is the promise. These things need to have this much silver in them. Now, I tell you this absurd ancient debate because it's actually an argument about power. And again, it's an argument that we're dealing with right now, today. Locke's position is actually super dumb because what he's saying is, okay, you know how people are like melting down these valueless coins and getting rid of the silver overseas? Let's give them more silver to do it with. Let's recoin the coins bigger and heavier and then give them back. But he was making this argument for a good reason. They'd been fighting a desperate war against monarchy, and one of the fundamental bulwarks of liberty was the concept of natural rights. That we have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is a phrase basically of Locke's that the framers took. We have those rights because they belong to us, not because they are given to us, but because they come to us naturally. So for Locke, the idea that something as important as money could become the sovereign's choice, that suddenly the king or a significant figure in power could just be like, the money's worth less now, deal. That was a catastrophe. The money had to be valuable in the same way that like a rock is heavy to some given amount of heaviness. And Locke won this argument, and it was a total catastrophe. The country essentially bled out for a while because the mint took in these clipped, sweated coins. They issued far fewer because they had to make the old weight, and then they were instantly melted down and exported. And it was really horrific. You read these accounts, and it's a little like reading like some of the things that happened in Greece during the height of the ongoing giant debt crisis, with sudden epidemics of suicides, trade freezing, people starting to go into malnutrition. It was a bad, bad situation. And the horrible thing is that framework, two dudes in wigs, that remains the poles of the planet of money on which we live. Which is to say, either you base your money, you base your value on nature, by which we mean shiny stuff that we extract from the ground at great cost and difficulty and danger. And it's not even necessarily that. The London Fix is actually how the value of gold is determined, but we can go back to that later. Or you base the value of money on the authority of king, country, and central bankers. Those are your choices. Or rather they were. I'm so happy that this image worked out. That the monarch on the left is Ethelred the Unready, also known as Ethelred the Ill-Advised, who seemed kind of appropriate for this. So those are the choices, or rather they were. Because cryptocurrency development and the related fields, this is deliberately a little bit, I wanted to undercut my own tendency to talk about how great the future is. Cryptocurrency development and the related fields of distributed organizations and autonomous corporations, voting pools, crypto equity, and new marketplaces and trading zones open up vast new fields of alternatives for us. So let's forget about some things for a second. Let's forget about this. And let's forget about the obsession with Satoshi and this poor son of a bitch running all over Los Angeles. Let's forget about the people digging through the dump in Wales to try to find the discarded hard drive with the keys to the Bitcoin stash on it. Let's forget about all the sort of classic criminal activity that just moves into any space that seems to offer fast return. This is ransomware, locks up your home folder, encrypts it. You can get the keys by sending them some money. Let's forget all of the different sort of criminal manifestations that surround people trying to trick other people into giving them Bitcoin. Or ancient spam scams. I love this in a weird way, just because it's like, shit, man, I wrote a book about spam. I've been reading about this stuff since the 1980s, and here it is, except now it's about Bitcoin. And all the rest of it. Let's forget for a second about the drugs. This is not my armodafinil, I hasten to add. Let's forget about all of the various attacks, the transaction malleability issues. Let's forget about the US Marshals selling off the Dread Pirate Roberts stash. Let's forget about people using Bitcoin to sell stolen identities. Let's momentarily forget about Weave, who is here, who I just saw downstairs, demanding payment in Bitcoins for all the time that he spent in prison from you lying subhuman garbage, the Department of Justice. Let's even forget about how disappointing this is. This is Walmart selling a Butterfly Labs miner with a 1-star review, which is just so terrific. And let's even forget about the really exciting stuff, about the amazing implications for remittance workers, for nonprofits, for people doing transactions during banking crises, or across national borders, or around sanctions and embargoes, or, I'm just gonna say it, it's so refreshing, a model of micropayments that might actually work in browser and completely eviscerate the online advertising market that turns every content provider into a snitch who's building the apparatus of espionage. God, wouldn't that be great? No more banner ads ever, no more sponsored content. The end. Oh, God, yeah. Ooh, I'm a little out of breath. And even forget for a second about kick-ass technical stuff, like using the broadcast TV spectrum to update the blockchain across the forests of northern Finland so that Lapp herdspeople can finally get on the Bitcoin train. This is something that's actually really kind of profound, because this is a system that offers us a chance to manage money as a community, as a collective, whether with persistent identities or as trusted anonymous strangers, which is enormous. This is something that lets us here at Hope, us hackers, us people in this world, to make decisions about issue, about validation, about authority, and about the circulation of power. This is the birth of distributed sovereignty. Just sort of imagine it in yourself. You know, you can hum the Jurassic Park theme. This is... when you hear what I'm about to say, which is the last paragraph of this, it's so over the top, there's no way I could not have things get really extreme here. This is the birth of distributed sovereignty and of the opportunity to construct social forms for which we do not yet have words, that can link up groups that don't need to agree so that they can pool resources, coordinate efforts, and coexist. Groups anywhere, and again, I'm not just talking about Bitcoin here, I'm talking about Ethereum, about contract management systems, about all those amazing things. Groups anywhere that have an interest in the push against coercion and centralized control. Diasporic communities, oppressed minorities, undocumented immigrants, students defaulting on their loans and walking away from the credit system, radicals, holders of unpopular opinions and congregants of unpopular religions, pacifists and anti-militarists who don't want their tax money to go to the vast, terrible machine, the unemployed, prisoners and felons, quilt bag communities in bigoted countries, nomads and vonu, squatters, lovers of mutual aid, the elderly who've been screwed out of their pensions and savings by the crisis and are now walking away from their underwater homes, pornographers, of course, you know, it's the internet, pornographers, inevitable, pirates and artists who refuse to participate in a crooked intellectual property regime, underground farms, co-ops, people who make raw milk cheese, God knows what all. There's a lot of different groups who could actually make enormous value from having these kinds of opportunities as long as we can build them for them. Money is one of the fronts on which the struggle for decentralization and autonomy in the 21st century will be fought. And we here have opportunities to contribute to that new space. The technologies are here. Some of them have been around for decades, but are now finding a whole new population of adopters and applications. Multi-party signatures, wireless mesh networking systems, zero-knowledge proofs, different variations on the blockchain system, and rate-limiting processes, mining things that take advantage of stuff that isn't just super hot ASICs sitting in your basement, voting pools, and sophisticated delegation methods. So I've had almost exactly 50 minutes, and we now have the rest of our lives to actually build all of this stuff and change society for the better. So thank you very much for your time and attention. Like I said, I made some ugly ass slides. So yeah, if we want to have questions, if we want to have a giant like group think get together, group think is a bad word about this. Not what I meant. Oh, we still got 2 minutes. I came out ahead of time. Can we just turn up the lights and open it to questions? Yeah, I'm happy to rant angrily for a while. Okay, yeah, if people wouldn't mind coming up to the mic there, where I think there's already a little line formed here. The mic is actually not on, unfortunately. Anything yet? Yeah, excellent.
Wow.
We couldn't have planned that better.
Okay, a note to self, don't yell into a microphone. So I want to thank you very much for the great talk. It was incredibly inspirational. I also I want to say I'm working on building a platform right now that allows communities to collectively decide what is valuable and then to generate the currency to pay them for what they believe to be valuable. So if
Interesting.
people want to pay for a community class, they just generate the currency to pay the community class, and then everyone attends for free. And if the community wants to keep supporting that, they have to accept the currency into their lives in exchange for the things that they can do.
Interesting. I mean, plug it, you know?
So it's called, it's the Jack of All Trades universe. It's Joatu, Joatu, .com or .org if you feel like donating. But if you want to contribute to it, we're building it in Ruby right now. We'll have an alpha. We're going to launch it in a couple months in Montreal. But the idea is that there will be pods. So you'll be able to exist with this currency, do the things you love, build your reputation up, travel the world with couch surfing, and live nomadically. That's what we're pushing
Awesome.
towards. So thank you so much for doing what you're doing,
My
too.
pleasure.
Thank
you too. Absolutely.
Hi, great talk. I have two questions. One, Emperor Norton from San Francisco. Are you aware? Okay, I thought
Yes.
you'd be a great addition to your the legacy money stuff.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah.
And two, topical. Like in the past couple of days, there's been a lot of chatter in the Bitcoin community about this state's bit license proposal. Are
Yes.
you familiar with that?
Oh,
And
God,
do you
yes,
have any?
yeah.
Whatever your opinion is about that, I'd like to hear it.
Well, so again, I'm hoping no one I work with is on the live stream right now because I there's, and I think we're out of time. Yes. Okay. So I apologize. I will be hanging around, drinking tons of caffeine. So, but yeah, very very briefly, there is value in perhaps regulating areas of cryptocurrency that have real social utility. But I think there's also a lot of utility to the stuff that's unregulated, to the stuff that's wild and free and strongly resistant to that, because we need to have open, resistant, problematic sectors of our society, or else we're in real deep trouble. Thank you again very much for your time.
Good evening, Hope. Okay, if we could take the discussion from the previous talk out to the hallway, please. That means you, Finney.
Is there anybody in here that could help me switch this video back there? Maybe somebody's done it before for me. Anybody? Be a big help for the Hope organization.
Okay, a couple of very quick announcements. As you know, but I'm going to keep announcing it for the rest of the day anyway. Everything's pushed forward an hour. This was the talk that is on your grids and your pamphlets as starting an hour ago. So welcome to an hour ago. Yes, all volunteers will be paid extra for the extra hour. They'll be paid double. Okay, without too much further ado, I just want to announce that if you're into electronic music, we have concerts going on downstairs at 10 o'clock, starting at 10 p.m. tonight. Downstairs by the escalator to the mezzanine is a brilliant concert. Chiptunes, electronic music, all kinds of cool stuff, dancing, and things of that sort. Flashing lights if you like those. So check that out tonight at 10 p.m. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to announce the next speaker. This is When You Are the Adversary, Quinn Norton.
Mics are always well above my head. So, over the last year and a half or so, you may have noticed that there's been some attention paid to big adversaries. I can't see my own slides. Yeah, and what I love about this is how much it they mirror each other very well. Everybody's like, you cannot speak its name. No, it's not returning. It was crushed by the church committee in the 70s. No, it was overcome by the power of the FISA, but now it has turned the power of the FISA for it. Like, it is very, very Voldemort-ish, our relationship with the NSA right now, especially in this community. But for about the same amount of time, actually longer, because these are really like the amazingly powerful, dangerous, sexy adversaries that all of us kind of in the action hero movie of our minds are up against. But I actually want to go through what actually happens in Harry Potter a little bit, because he doesn't spend most of the time fighting Voldemort. Like, at best, he spends a lot of it fighting his minions, which might be like local law enforcement, bureaucracies, But really, what does he spend most of the time in most of the stories doing? He's fighting like family and his peers and administration and staff and content filtration and of course the IT department. So what is a small adversary? Well, a small adversary is someone that is out to stop you or out to get you or something like that, and doesn't have the unlimited power and prestige and glory of the NSA and the FBI and all these other three-letter acronyms. Often when I'm thinking of modeling that adversary, I think of the great database in the sky where joins are instantaneous. And all that information, whether it's like my transit card and my cell phone data, and all that can be instantly correlated. But the truth is, most adversaries are just jerks. And jerks are part of the meta-adversary environment as well. Because, and I want this to stick in for, everyone knows Nick Burns, right? Like, okay, I can't see you, but raise your hand if you are Nick Burns. I think I see like one or two hands. There's more of you. Face it. But the adversaries are not super powerful. Sometimes they're not that smart, but they are out to get you or out to stop you. And they can be quite dangerous. I did this because I wanted to be gender balanced. But I'm also okay saying most of the creepy people are white, apparently. But these adversaries have very real effects, and they span all of our lives. The thing about small adversaries is that only a few people really in their day-to-day life worry about the big adversaries, but the small adversaries target everyone on the planet. And they target everyone with whatever technological means they have to hand. Sometimes, and back in history, that was gossip at the watering hole, right? Now it's all sorts of things. But let's talk about who, real quick before I go on, who the little adversaries are. They can be local police. They can be corrupt local police. They can be a corrupt security guard. They can be your IT department. If you are trying to whistleblow, they might be your IT department. If you are trying to get a different job, they might also be your IT department. If you are trying to commit industrial espionage, still your IT department. They are in corporations and schools and organizations and even NGOs. These are things that are sometimes trying to block you and stop you from getting out your communication or getting to your information. They are in bureaucracies. They are skitties. I mean, I know that there's not a huge amount of respect for skitties in this community, but there should be a huge amount of respect for the damage they can do because there's so freaking many of them. Their schools and their families. They're honor killings at their worst. They're partners that are committing domestic violence to partners that don't have the information to get out of those situations. They're friends that mean well. They're stalkers that don't mean well. And sometimes they're just random ponage. And that can have real, devastating effects on people's lives when your grandmother has been owned by that many botnets and she can't reach out and communicate with her family, that isolation has health consequences in later age. These things can be quite powerful. So what are the tools of small adversaries? Well, I mean, physical access is obviously one of them. One of the major tools that we see with Facebook and families is making you give up your password. That's a really important one. One of the other places we see that is Syria. I'd like to let that sink in for a moment. And the tactic they use in Syria is to have more than one Facebook account. Now, is that going to come as a huge surprise to teenagers out there that you can do that? Are they going to be like, we've learned so much from the Syrian resistance? So there's all these coping mechanisms we develop with our small adversaries. And then there's the explicit tools. And a lot of us probably know these ones. This one was just in the news. But there's plenty of other ones that are not necessarily billed as hacker tools, but let's all be clear that rats do the same thing. Whether you're doing it for good or evil, they are exactly the same thing. They are getting root and taking control of everything. And so like this is a more legitimate one, although it's got this page, which I find hilarious. That should take care of it. Now, I think it's one person that's just still laughing. Have you used this software? And of course, like what are the ways that these things get delivered? Well, the main way that I've seen, and I should say a little bit about where I come from for this talk, maybe earlier in the talk, but here we are. Where I come from with this is that I spend most of my life working in the field as a journalist. And the people that I'm working with who need security tools don't need them in an academic way. They need something right now. They may or may not have thought about this in advance. It's a real part of their life. I have been on the phone to somebody trying to step them through how to do an open SSL command line to encrypt a file. I don't recommend this as an OPSEC method, but when you got nothing else, it is something. So my perspective is a really practical one. And at some point in all of this, I will probably piss almost everyone in this room off because I'm specifically going to try and go after a lot of the security community's sacred cows. But we see these things. We see them all over the place. And the thing is, we also know that we aren't seeing most of them. So how are they getting to people? Well, they're getting to people via their email a lot of the time. Sometimes it's physical access, but email attachments. And I just want to say about this little phishing email that I didn't have anything for the slide before my talk, and I just refreshed my mail 3 or 4 times. And then I am actually a Chase customer, so potentially this was